Welcome, everyone. I am Courtney Cheetah, and I'm the Program Associate with Wild Farm Alliance. Thanks for joining us today for the Whole Farm Sustainable Pest Management course. This is the 10th lesson of 12, and our mission is to promote a healthy, vibrant agriculture that protects and restores wild nature. And we want to help bring nature back to farms. And this is just a reminder that all participants are muted. If you're experiencing any technical issues, there are moderators in the chat to help. And please use the chat to ask questions for our presenters. Our 2050 vision is to see 1 million nest boxes and perches on farms, hedgerows, and habitat the length to the moon and back to help support all different kinds of beneficials on the farm and restore riparian areas because they are the lifeblood of the landscape. And we really feel like avian pest control is part of the toolbox in managing crops. Next, I want to share a new resource with you that we're building and invite you to join us. If you're an expert in sustainable pest management and would like to showcase your expertise to growers and potential clients, complete the profile builder. Your location will be featured on an interactive map with detailed pop-up information enabling growers to quickly find experts specializing in their crops and addressing their unique needs located in their area. And the link is in the chat to the profile builder. So just click on that and that'll get you to there. We also have an awesome new publication hot off the presses and up on our website, the Managing Pests with Predator and Parasitoid Habitat publication. Check it out and learn all about SNAP, the shelter, nectar, alternative food sources, and pollen, and proactive cultural practices that complement farmscaping measures, including how to create a blanket of attack. There are 10 natural enemies for 10 major crops grown in California covered in detail, and it's just a really great resource. Very exciting to have that in your toolbox. Today's webinar is providing habitat for predatory insects and wasp parasitoids with Ian Gruttenberger from UC Davis and Michael Russell from Oregon State University. The next webinar in our series will be in 2 weeks on February 25th. And that's going to be a day in the life of scouts and a PCA with Jessica Vaughn and Doug O'Brien from Vaughn Consulting and Jim Davis from Better Bugs IPM. And if you've missed any of the lessons in this series, please consider going back and checking the earlier ones out. They've been really great. All the recordings are up on the website under the online courses, under news and events on our website. And we have continuing education credits available from DPR and ASA. If you're seeking those CEU credits, we will have pop-up polls after each speaker that we'd like you to participate in. And then at the end, we will have a link to a quiz and evaluation form where you can share your license number with us for the CEU credit. I'm going to pass this off to Ian next. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And if you have any issues, let us know and we can try and help. But take it away, Ian.
That look okay?
That looks great.
Okay. Okay, so my title's pretty broad there in terms of providing habitat for predatory insects. But what I was asked to speak on, or kind of where I ended up, was talking about some specific hemipteran predators, specifically minute pyre bugs, as well as spiders. So there we go. So I know this has been kind of themes throughout a lot of this, a lot of these webinars, but I think it's important as I go into talking about the specific taxa in terms of what we're talking about for habitat manipulation and kind of how I was in a little bit interpreting it, because I think for a lot of this we're thinking about both the habitat manipulation or what the habitat looks like in terms of physical environment, but also farming practices which affect that overall environment. And I think those can be really important and can be really big drivers. And so overall, when we're thinking about these taxa, it's a combination of both supporting their populations as well as the actual biocontrol service that they're providing, the predation service. And so some of this is just about this general environment, the general habitat, as well as trying to limit negative management effects. And this could be pest management, pesticides, or, various other just farming practices, which I'll get to in terms of tillage or something like that. So really having that goal of improving biocontrol. And so when I'm talking about the specific resources for these predators, there's that this acronym SNAP, so shelter, nectar, alternative prey, or pollen. And I think these definitely have relevance here for what we're talking about. And so for shelter, it doesn't necessarily the crop doesn't necessarily provide all the shelter that's needed for these arthropods. Sometimes it may be outside of the field, or maybe the understory, the crop residue, or some other plant that's also out in that field, possibly. And so this covers both shelter in the field, near the field, and like I said, it's a possibility that other plants are also providing shelter. And then also providing shelter through time can be pretty important, especially for some long-lived or larger arthropods, which I think really comes into play for spiders too. So kind of getting into food, nectars, oftentimes these predators don't specialize just on the focal pest, and they need other types of food. Nectar is one of them, which does have relevance for some of the things that I'm talking about. Glucose, fructose, sucrose that's coming from flowers or extrafloronectaries. Alternative prey, I think this is definitely important for the predators that we're talking about because they feed on a wide number of things. And so this is especially important for these generalist natural enemies. And it can help with temporal stability through time. And it can also promote establishment in the first place in terms of getting these predators into fields. And it can also, having diversity in prey community can also increase the resilience of the community there. But they can also distract from the focal prey, which I think we'll get to too. And then pollen, so providing protein for insects. That's especially important for mining pirate bugs there and for some other species. And then, like I said, I think these management practices are also just as important, if not more important sometimes than these other resources when we're thinking about the farm habitat. And that can be what's being applied, as well as what kinds of disturbance are happening. And really thinking about it from a habitat and farming practices at various spatial scales, because these insects are mobile. They're moving are arthropods, even spiders, we think of them, they feel like they're not moving that much, but they are very mobile and they are colonizing from nearby edges, especially when they're small. And so we can start thinking about the habitat at different spatial scales. And again, thinking about how management across the farm may be affecting them. So to get right into the taxa then, with that background, I think just to try to kind of provide a baseline there for how we were thinking about them. So minute pirate bugs are Anthocoridae. There's a few different genera there, Aureus, Anthocorus. Aureus are one of the ones that are most common, and they're most common as well in the greenhouse or high tunnel type systems is where you often run into them too. And often because they're also commercially available from beneficial insectaries or insectaries as well, sometimes for purchase. So that's the other thing why they're often discussed or seen. And overall, they're relatively small, which is important in terms of how they're serving as predators, and also some aspects about their biology, ecology. And I put this somewhat complicated taxonomic thing up here, but basically, they're part of the true bugs. So at the very top, there's some, damsel bugs, they're related. We also, just in terms of the minute pirate bugs, they're also related to things like bed bugs and bat bugs as well. So there's this wide range of feeding styles for minute pirate bugs. But for kind of some of the key aspects of minute pirate bugs that affect what kind of habitat, what they need, and how they serve as predators. So one aspect is that they're heavy metabolism. So the adults and nymphs are very ecologically similar. They don't go through a pupal stage. The nymphs look very similar to the adults, except smaller. But that means that, they're operating at a slightly smaller spatial scale than the adults. They don't have wings, so they're not dispersing like the adults do. They're where they are at. That's their habitat on that plant. And also in terms of the food that they're eating, the nymphs will be eating somewhat smaller food than the adults, but not by a lot. In terms of their life cycle, so at the top right there, the Aureus, their eggs are inserted into the plant tissue. So that can be important in terms of having a plant that serves as a substrate for their eggs, but they will lay eggs in a lot of different plants. And also having, because they're inside the plant, systemic insecticide could possibly affect their eggs there. And overall, they're found in many crops and habitats, and they also have very short generation times, which can be important in terms of their habitat that's required. They can respond reasonably quickly to pulses of resources or changes in the environment. So they can both move in as adults, because they are mobile, and then also their generation times. I mean, they can reproduce fairly quickly, especially compared to some of the other heteroptera and predators. And so minute prior bugs, they're omnivorous, so they can make use of a variety of foods, which is very important there. And so for animal prey, though, it can be very key. It's key for reproduction and fertility. So having that animal prey. And they will feed on soft-bodied insects and eggs. So in the bottom right there, they're feeding on some eggs. And so those are the eggs of a big bug next to this little bug. But they can be important predators of like Lepidoptera eggs. And then, their size, they're also the resources that they're using and eating, but also the pests they're controlling are things like thrips, whiteflies, aphids, etc. Sorry. And so what's important for these is because they're omnivorous, they can use plant resources to establish or to bridge low prey availability. So they don't necessarily have to have animal prey there present to survive. And so, a good example here is Aureus insidiosus, which is heavily associated with corn, and the associated pollen there. And I put that image at the bottom. They do not need humans. That is human skin there. They don't need that, but they're actually become so abundant in corn-driven or corn-dominated ecosystems, the Midwest, that they can become a nuisance pest because they will probe humans and try to feed on them. But they can use these plant resources, so that can be important for the habitat that you provide, because they can become established just based off of the plants that are there, feeding on the plants themselves, the leaves, but also really feeding on the nectar and pollen resources. Intragale predation can be important, when we're thinking about generalist predators, because they will feed on other things will feed on them at times. That's kind of the thing that you run into with these generalist predators. And I did want to know, at times multiple sources of food can be beneficial, and it can get them established. So having pollen there can, get them there, make sure that they can become established, but it can also reduce predation on a target pest at times, but it can also reduce intrakill predation. So there's kind of a number of different pluses and minuses there, but that's sort of just the complexity of dealing with these generalist predators, which can make it sometimes have unpredictable effects, I guess, in terms of we may try to manipulate them through habitat, or if you're doing releases, but if they're preferring to feed on something else, you may not get the predation service that you may want necessarily, but it can also mean that they're more resilient because they can persist. And so here's an example too there, where for Aureus, various Aureus species, they eat whiteflies, but in a specific study, they preferred thrips if both are present. So it can, have that distraction, which could be important for consideration. So in terms of habitat manipulation, so hopefully kind of laid the groundwork for this. So for flowering plants, they can be really important for plant food, providing that. Intercropping or cover crops can be important, both in terms of the structural habitat, but as you can imagine, having those other resources, especially the plant food, but there may also be pest insects that are non-pests or herbivores that are also providing prey for the minute pirate bugs. And then shelter the overwintering sites can be important, as well as continuity of habitat through time. Although, like I said, can be reasonably mobile, which can be helpful for establishment. And for farming practices, it's important, obviously, limiting insecticides, especially broad spectrum insecticides. And this can be also important because they can have exposure through the plant, such as like with systemic insecticides and insecticides that do have activity against hemipterans. They can be affected because they're feeding on a lot of things. They're feeding on the animal prey, but they're also feeding on plant material. So that can sort of lead to more pronounced effects. So the other thing I'm going to talk about briefly are spiders and harvestmen. So these are extremely diverse. I would say they're often understudied and oftentimes sometimes people will go into detail, but at the same time, you see in various pest management work, people will just say spiders, which is a very broad group. But really, there's a lot of nuance there in terms of the different taxa. But you can see a lot of different spider taxa out in fields, and so they are typically part of the natural enemy complex. They're out there in some form, typically. They're part of this background generalist natural enemy complex that we often see um, in um, in cropping systems, especially cropping systems that um, don't have a lot of disturbance and have more complexity there. And they will feed on a variety of prey. Oftentimes, they do specialize on things, but spiders are a good example of generalists where a lot of times, if they can feed on it, they will functionally. And just here's an example from California showing different, those are all families that were found of spiders in alfalfa. And alfalfa does have a lot of natural enemies in it, but this is just an example showing like spiders is a very broad category and there's lots of different spiders there. And some of those are web spinning, some of those are big webs, some of those are sheet webs, some of those are ground spiders. So they can have very different lifestyles basically, but also there are a lot of spiders out there. And so, there's various feeding behaviors. So for example, wolf spiders are stalk and ambush. So, they're finding insects, especially that are on the ground, that are wandering around. And so that can be, they could be important predators for caterpillars and Lepidoptera, especially early season ones, various cutworms or something like that, or armyworms, where they're walking around. The spiders are also hunting and they stalk and ambush them. They will also move up into the foliage, especially when they're active at night. Other spiders, form sheet webs. That's one family there. They form a funnel. Other spiders will form horizontal sheet webs, and that's what they're using to find their prey. And so you can imagine how they affect pests can be really important or can vary depending on their feeding habit, right? So a small sheet web spider is probably not going to take out a large caterpillar. And it's also, if it's under the crop, it's probably not moving up or it's not going to be interacting with, whitefly nymphs at the top of the canopy. So it's just kind of important to consider in terms of their prey function. In terms of their habitat, they vary. So their habitats vary, so do options to foster them. So for ground dwelling spiders, so wolf spiders, nephosids, crab spiders, they benefit from ground cover. That's both because it provides shelter and also provides food. So all of those ground dwelling arthropods, although everything from crickets to I'm blanking, springtails, having more complexity there provides them food. So leaf litter, mulch, some sort of cover there can be helpful. So that's where cover crops can be beneficial to supporting these ground spiders, as well as no-till. So it's not, completely disturbing their primary habitat, primary environment. And then field edges with cover, it can also be important for sources, right? So especially if you're starting from stretch, they need to come from somewhere, especially for these ground spiders. They're not dispersing long distances necessarily by air. Vegetation dwelling spiders, so arachnids, celticids, jumping spiders, linyphiids, a sheet web. Really what they're responding to are plant structure. So that can be crop or other. And border habitats can also be important there, in terms of providing habitat for reproducing spiders to move into fields. And just finally, there's just an example here for cotton in Arizona where crab spiders have been shown to be a key predator of whiteflies. And so a lot of great work from Peter Ellsworth, among some other folks, has factored these natural enemies into thresholds for whiteflies. So scouting, this is just the whitefly adult thresholds, but basically factoring in and showing that crab spiders are a key natural enemy in their system, along with these other natural enemies. So a bunch of generalists. And really, in this case, protecting them through insecticide selection is a key practice. So targeted selective insecticides can help preserve spiders and avoiding broad spectrum insecticides. And then just overall habitat for spiders, having complexity there, plant diversity of some sort, cover crops, crop diversity, various crops or intercrops can help. Additional habitat near fields can be really helpful for spiders, especially ones that aren't dispersing as far. Limited physical disturbance helps, especially with those ground spiders. And like I said, insecticides definitely will affect spiders. And so keeping that in keeping that in mind in terms of if we're trying to foster robust natural enemies and specifically spiders there. With that, I will end. It was a minute or two over, but I don't know if you guys wanted to do questions now or, well, at the end, I couldn't remember.
Yeah, we'll jump into our poll questions.
Yes.
It's so cool to learn more about the plants and practices that support these predatory insects. Thank you so much. So we have two questions that should have popped up, and if you could answer those, and then we'll give it a minute for people to respond, and then I'll have Ian you go over them. Okay, we're just at that 80% threshold. So why don't we close the poll and we can share the results. And Ian, do you want to go over those?
Okay. Yeah, so when I provided questions, I had some that I think were a little bit more clear cut. And this one had a little bit more nuance. So I think the majority put chasing down or ambushing their prey, which is kind of what I had said there. I think the other one is very similar, but I think I'd argue is wolf spiders often aren't jumping down off of things. That's more of a jumping spider type of behavior, but I'd argue that's also very close. And then in terms of the other ones, they're not web spitting spiders, so those ones definitely would apply to other spiders. And then yes, so in terms of supporting spider populations, avoiding broad spectrum insecticides is important. And the other ones, I guess, frequent tillage would probably not help your spider populations, and then the other ones kind of, well, releasing houseflies just wouldn't be a thing. And keeping keeping fields as clean as possible reduces the habitat complexity, which spiders certainly benefit from for a variety of reasons.
Great. And I just see two quick questions. There's a question about are there any spiders commercially available that you know of?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
For the spider piece. I think
Cool.
that does speak to the spiders are great generalists that are out there, but oftentimes there's not often a key spider species that's dominating. Caveat, sometimes they are in a few cases, but then I don't think they were. And then
Yeah, are you familiar with the minute pirate bug Dephoriella afar? It's a common under grape bark, also in stick-tight almonds.
gotcha. Short answer is no. But also I don't work much in perennial crop. Well, but don't work much. I don't work in perennial crops. So but yeah,
Okay.
I'll look into that.
Awesome.
Sorry, I was scrolling. Oh, I see. There we go.
No
The
worries.
AI chat joke.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's shift over to Michael and his presentation. And we'll come back at the end for more questions for Ian. Thanks.
All righty. Hello, everybody. Let's get my share is hiding. There it is. All right. Well, hello, everybody. I am the impressive Michael Russell with the Institute for Natural Resources, Oregon State University. And let me get this out of the way as long as possible. And so I am going to talk about like identifying plants that are likely floral resources for parasitoid wasps. There's this, I'm gonna get like screens. And so basically what makes a plant a good provider of floral resources? You know, the idea is that we've told you the SNAP acronym, you must have heard quite a bit. So nectar and pollen are floral resources. And how do you identify them on your landscape? And how do you find plants that will be good floral resources? There we go. And so a good overview is this book, Habitat Planning for Beneficial Insects. I assume it's kind of similar to the one that they just plugged earlier that they put out, but this is from the Xerces Society. It has a lot of what I'm talking about and all sorts of other stuff about beneficial insects. It's a very comprehensive guide. So I'm going to first talk about a review of like what are floral resources. The main ones include pollen and nectar. And so kind of to compare and contrast, pollen is part of the plant's reproductive life cycle. And so it's mostly, or it's produced by every flower will produce pollen because it's part of making a seed. Whereas nectar is used as a lure for pollinators, and so it's generally limited to animal pollinated plant species. Pollen has a higher protein content, and nectar is mostly sugar. Pollen is generally like a solid powder. Nectar is a liquid exudate. Um, Pollen is produced in anthers. Nectar is produced in nectaries. And as far as like what sort of resources it provides, pollen being higher in protein is like for building more insects. So bees will make a little pollen ball to feed their larvae. And Ian was talking about as a supplementary food for when prey is scarce, a lot of predatory bugs and mites and ladybirds, beetles will use that. Whereas the nectar is just kind of food to keep the insect alive or the animal alive and reproducing. And so that's used by all sorts of animals, like bees will use it to stay alive, and butterflies, many flies. And then the focus of my talk today is parasitoid wasps, and they're definitely use this nectar. There we go. So when we're thinking about what makes a plant a good provider for floral resources, some of the questions you want to ask when you're looking at the plant is it animal pollinated, wind pollinated, or self-pollinated? Mostly it will be the animal pollinated plants that will provide floral resources and nectar because they're trying to draw in the animals. Is pollen or nectar produced and accessible to the insects? So you can kind of examine the flowers and look to see if that pollen and nectar is produced there. And then you look at the shape of the flowers to see, whether your target insect can get at those nectaries. And then also, does it produce a significant quantity of nutritious nectar? This is harder to get by just looking at it, but that's something that's important for a good plant. There. And so here's a couple examples of non-animal pollinated plants. So the most common and familiar would be grasses. And grasses, you see this picture, you can see the anthers hanging off, but they don't really have flowers as most people think of flowers. So they're just kind of green and inconspicuous. And so that's a clue that they're animal pollinated. So there's that grass, the California brome, and then down at the bottom is pigweed. It's kind of similar to grass. It's just a green, sort of prickly little flowers that aren't showy. And then over on the right, we have the black cottonwood, and that has these dangly catkins that are a little more showy with the red-brown sort of stuff on there, but not that showy. And one thing about them is that they hang down. And so that's a clue that it's a wind-pollinated species because they hang down and shake the pollen out. And so animal pollinated species are typically conspicuous, like colorful or fragment flowers like that sunflower there. And so they have big flowers that are something that is colorful, so it'll draw the animals in. Whereas this example of a catkin, so a shrub, these willow catkins, and notice that they're upright. So that's a sign that it's an animal pollinated flower if it's on a catkin. If it's upright, animal pollinated. If it's hanging down, it's wind pollinated. And so then you're going to look for nectaries. And so here's two pictures of flowers with nectaries. I have the one on the left is a Mariposa lily. And you can see those yellow sort of arcs in the bottom, and those are the nectaries. And so those are very obvious. That's why I chose this one because they're beautiful and obvious. And then on the right is the buckwheat, and it kind of has the greenish yellow bases of those petals. And if you look at them, they're kind of sticky or succulent, sort of moist even sometimes, and that's because they're exuding that nectar out from glands in the tissue there. And oftentimes they'll be like cup shaped so that as the nectar exudes, it can build up into a droplet or a little puddle so that the insects can drink out of the nectary. And then is it accessible? So this is some pictures of some parasitoid wasps, and these are very blown up, I guess, depending on your screen. But wasps are pretty tiny, usually mostly smaller than a housefly. They're a little different shape, and some of them are a little bigger, but a lot of them can be small, and some of them are very tiny. So they're not able to get into many deep flowers. So you can see some of these flowers, they have to really be able to get right at that nectary to be able to access the nectarine. So you want to look at the shape of the flower to see if some of these little tiny insects can get at the nectaries. And so here's some drawings. This is from a study where they looked at different flowers, and you can see like the black on that diagram, the black dots are the nectary, and there's a scale drawing of the little wasp that they were focusing on. And you can see number one, it has a big old nectary that's right up top, and that wasp can easily access it. Number two has, different location, but they're still up on top and easy to access. Number three, it's a little deeper, and probably the wasp could get in there if it tried. But then we get to 4 and 5, and their nectaries are small and down at the bottom of a tubular flower. And so those wasps are going to have a very hard time getting at it. And you can see on the graphs off to the right. So the buckwheat is right there is like, if you look at the bars show like the width of the head of the wasp, kind of put that in scale, and then the depth of the corolla or the flower, and the aperture, the width of the flower opening. And you can see buckwheat has a very wide opening, very shallow flower, easy for that wasp to get in there. And you can see the arrow goes down, and it has the longest longevity in this experiment, which means that it was a good source of nectar. Whereas you get on the other side, you have the white clover and red clover, where they have a deep corolla with a narrow opening, and the wasp is not able to get in there, and it only lives for 10 days before it starves to death. And so this is an example of a study that people have done quite a bit, where they enclose a bunch of wasps with either water in the control or water and a single type of flower in a treatment, and then they see how long the wasps live. And so I did a review of a bunch of these studies, and I'm going to talk about that to help explain what's a good flower for wasps. And so this is my results. This is like all of the species that came out, and you can see, I think in general, there was about 65 species that have been included in these studies by 2015. There's probably a couple more that have come out since then. But anyway, you can see that this list, and some of them do better than others. But what I want to point out is this list is long. It's so long that I have to like zoom it out for you to see it. But it's only 65 species, and I'm not sure where everybody's from, but there's probably hundreds and even maybe 1,000, more than 1,000 different species that could be found on farms and be useful on farms around the country. And this is just 65. So it's interesting to see which ones do good. And those are definitely ones to follow up on if they will work in your farm system. But it's also important to recognize what makes these good nectar sources, so you can see what's available for your farm and whether you could use one of these species or a different species. And one way to look at that is to compare by families. So plant families generally have the same sort of floral architecture, and so they'll have the same. So if they have nectar in one of a family, it's likely that others in that family have nectar, and it's likely that others have a similar architecture, so the wasp cannot get in there. And so there's the list of what I looked at by family, and I'm going to go through them with some pictures to see what we're talking about. So these are the top species or top families that came around. And you can see, again, there's the lily family and the buckwheat family that we were talking about before with the nectaries. So they have obvious nectaries. They produce a lot of nectar, and they have wide open flowers. And so they did very well. They're at the top of this chart. Whereas another one is that hound's tongue and the forget-me-not family, again, with open flowers, or the rose family down in the lower right, open flowers with nectaries. You have the milkweed, which those flowers aren't as open, obviously, but the nectaries are still accessible, and they do produce quite a bit of nectar, so that they are a good source because they do produce so much nectar. And then the carrot family, they also have open, but this picture shows you don't really see the open flowers because it's kind of far out, but you do see that there's a ton of flowers on that dill plant. And so that's another thing. Having just a lot of flowers there is good. Here's the next set. These are also good. And this shows another close-up of a carrot flower with the wasp at it, and you can see it can get easily into those open flowers. But we have the bittersweet and the tomato family, another crabapple picture. Down at the bottom, there's a chickweed, and on the left, there's a fireweed, and you can see, and then the brassica with the fly on it. And you can see those have open flowers, and you can see the fly is able to get right at that nectar at the base of that petal. And so again, we're looking at open flowers that the wasp can get into, and then that have nectar production. This is kind of like the mid zone. And so these are species that, they still improve the life longevity of those wasps, but it's not not as much. And so one of the things that you notice on these, they're more like tubular flowers. So they have, again, the narrow opening and the deep corolla. And so you look at the foxglove up there at the upper left, and that has a really wide opening, but it's pretty deep. So maybe some wasps will be able to get in there and get some, but maybe others will not because they're afraid or whatever. And then the bee balm on the upper right has very narrow flowers. It'd be hard for a wasp to get in there. And then in the lower right, you have the pea family, the fava bean and the red clover. And again, you can see those are very narrow flowers. And if you've seen the pea flowers, they're actually kind of uh, shaped in such a way that a big heavy bee will like kind of pop them open so the bee can get the pollen and nectar in there, but a little light wasp will not do that, and it's hard for them to get in there. One thing I wanted to bring up with these pea family things is some of these species have extra floral nectaries. And so this is something where beyond what the flower is producing, there's nectaries maybe on the leaves or nodes or something where these wasps can access it without having to go through the flower. And that's something to think about whether the species you're looking at has extra floral nectaries. They're not super common, but it's something to remember. And the sunflower was one of the species, this prairie fleabane. It has a they do have tubular flowers, but I want to point out that this family is very diverse. And so the Asteraceae down there is kind of low. It was on the positive side, but one thing to remember, it's very diverse, and they only had so many flowers that were tested, and there's hundreds of species in the sunflower family. So it's always good to think about what the family tells you about what you can predict, but then look at the actual plants that are available to you to see, do they fit the model of the family? And so some of these sunflowers might do better or worse than it came out here on the graph. And then here's some examples of ones that had no effect on the, or no increase in longevity. And so this is like the pigweed or the lamb's quarter. And you can see those are fully in flower pictures right now, but that you can't see any flowers. They're just like these little misshapen or prickly little green patches at the nodes. And it's because they're not trying to draw an insect, so they do not have any nectar available. And just to review, I'm going to kind of bounce back. And so here's the top finishers, like big wide open flowers with visible nectaries, more open flowers than these other ones above average. In the middle, we've got these ones with tubular flowers that are more hit or miss. And then ones where their flowers are not even apparent. Those are likely not going to be sources of nectar. So again, to review, so we're looking for showy flowers, again, for presence of nectaries and open flower architecture. And so those are like what you're looking at when you look at a flower. But as you're going around, I encourage you to like look for parasitoid wasps foraging on flowers, because that's really going to tell you what's working in your system. And so if you see parasitoid wasps as you're out and about, maybe follow them back, see if they're going to a flower. And if they are, you can see, or if you see a flower and there's all these bugs, you can look at, oh, those are parasitoid wasps feeding on the nectar. What is this plant? And that's a good clue that those would be useful for parasitoid wasps. Another thing that goes beyond like looking at these things is whether they fit in your agro ecosystem. And so by fit, I mean like they're not disruptive to production practices. They don't have seeds that get caught up in the harvest equipment and contaminate your crop, or they're not invasive in your fields or in nearby habitats. You don't want invasive species making problems elsewhere. And then yes, they are easy to manage so that, and to ensure good productivity year after year. So you want it to be something that there's not a lot of extra work to deal with to keep them productive, producing lots of flowers every year. And then also maybe think about, do these plants have other benefits beyond just supplying nectar? So like, are they good wildlife habitat? Are they pretty to look at? Or, whatever else? Do they have pollen for these beneficial other things that need pollen? And so where they can fit, this is a drawing that people I worked with made back when I was doing this research. And it kind of shows you an example of farm with all the different places that they thought you could put flower. And I'm going to start here with, there's the stripe kind of over on the left that's yellow and white alternating stripes. And that I think is showing kind of an annual, that's where you could fit like a buckwheat or dill in there, where you just kind of take a space out of some of your annual crops and put in these annual cover crops or annual flowering insectary plants. And so that fits real well into an annual system. You can also have flowers that come out like as part of the crop. So over on the left, you have the apple orchard and the berry orchard, or like maybe the sunflower seed crop. And so that's part of making the crop is actually flowers. So by having those out there, you're increasing your nectar availability. And then I don't know, you can look and guess what some of this other stuff is. One thing I'd like to mention is depending on your system, maybe you have something you harvest like lettuce or radishes or something that you kind of harvest, but then at the end they start bolting, and then maybe you don't just till them under right away. You let them bolt and flower so that right there in your fields there's some flower availability in there. There's also like perennial habitats that are kind of part of your system, like a pasture or maybe the roads where there could be weeds in there that aren't a really big problem for you, but are, could have flowers. And then you can have, I think in the corner of the apple, there's a perennial insectary planting. And then my favorite is always the natural areas at the sides of your field. So you can have riparian areas or hedgerows or any sort of natural areas and that's where it's really interesting. I mean, you can go to your local extension agents, and they often have lists of good flower resources, and you can check those, or that's where you can just check any sort of natural areas and see what sort of flowers are out there and take what I've talked about today to try to see if they work good and see if they will fit in the natural areas that are on the farms that you're working with. And that's my 15 minutes and 30 seconds. And so I think we'll move on to to the other people with the questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's so cool to sort of learn about the science behind why all those little teeny tiny flowers are so effective sources of nectar. I love it. Okay, so we've launched the poll questions for Michael's questions. Please check those out and respond.
Yeah, and there was some comments that came up that I can maybe talk about while people are making their choices. There's a requirement. That's interesting. There's someone made a comment about milkweed can trap bees. I never really heard about that, so that's an interesting thing to look at. I do believe citrus trees have extra floral nectaries. I don't have that information in front of me, but I think that's something I heard. But yeah, there's a lot of things that have them, and so that's something to think about. And there's the poll question. So I think that's it.
Yeah, and I think you
A
covered
windborne grass pollen, like corn pollen. So yeah, so that's that would not be for beneficial insects, but like Ian was talking about, corn pollen can be beneficial for other predators and such.
Great. Well, we're at that 80%. Let's end the poll and then we can review those.
Yes, and so we can just go through. Everybody said wide corollas, so good job, almost everybody. Orange color, so the color is a thing for attracting insects. So color is part of the flower's attraction, and blue is often considered something that attracts bumblebees, and yellow is maybe things that attract other things. And then the deep corollas are like not. So deep means that they can't get in there, whereas wide means that it's easy to get in there. So deep is like a lot of times those deep corollas are designed or whatever, they're effective at keeping out other sort of nectar foragers and just limiting it to the bees, because bees are more effective pollinators. So they hide the corolla so only the bees can get it, so they're not wasting the nectar on things that aren't pollinating as well. And then some of the other families, so the spinach family, the Chenopodiaceae is not good. They don't have the showy flowers. Ericaceae, they have tubular flowers that are kind of narrow and deep, and so there probably wouldn't be good nectar access for there. The Apiaceae, those are famously great. And the Malvaceae, those are probably pretty good. A lot of them are pretty open too, so those are probably pretty good. But Apiaceae is the one that will, if you go to your extension website, they'll say Apiaceae wherever you are. Yeah, so that's all of it.
Great.
That.
Awesome. If there are any other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And I think you when you were talking about the buckwheat, were you talking about perennial or annual?
The annual buckwheat. So this is like the one that you get, like kasha is the Russian name or something. And so there are a bunch of wild buckwheats that are out, and those are also great nectar sources, but harder to get. Those would where maybe you'd put them on if you have a hillside next to your field or something that could put some buckwheat or just an insectary planting along the edge. That would be a great choice, but these are the annual buckwheat. It's often sold just as a flower, or it's the crop, the kasha crop.
Nice. Have a specific favorite flower nectar source?
I guess I was going to get into that since no one's asking questions, is that I did mention like these lists, and you can find lists from extension sources or wherever blogs or whatever. People probably make lists. People want to share their knowledge and such. And those lists are again like my list of 65 in that graph I showed you are going to be limited. And so again, take this information, go out there and find it. I actually don't work in this field too much. I'm more of a wildlands botanist, and so I'm definitely pro finding native plants to plant in your field, and that's great. It makes your place good habitat, and you can get benefits from it. So I would think about if you have a patch of ground or what you heard people are working with or looking at, look at native plants, and then you can like go through what's available at a native plant nursery or something, and then kind of look at their flowers and see if they meet these criteria that I laid out.
Awesome.
And so Jim Davis has a question that's pretty relevant. So he asked about this Weast spray. I'm not really sure what exactly that is, but if you went back to, if you were sharp-eyed, you might have seen something called Lemonade and something else on my table. And those were, commercial products that are available. I don't know, depending on how they spread them around the field, but it's basically like sugar water solutions that are there to provide this nectar or the sugar water resource that naturally is provided by nectar, but this is a way to do it if you're limited on nectar or you want to overload it or something. So I guess that's what this Weast stuff is.
Have you seen any evaluation of them?
Oh yeah, they were in that. And insect honeydew is another thing. So like a lot of these things will eat the honeydew is like this sugar solution that comes out of these little tubes on the back of aphids, or different plant bugs will produce to kind of when they're getting overwhelmed with the sugar and the sap. They kind of excrete it, and so that's another source. So those are in that table, and they have been proven to be successful at supporting wasp longevity. And yeah. So then there's stuff on, I think there's a question about habitat you would recommend to support predatory mites from Ashley. That's something for Ian, I imagine.
Specifics. I mean, sometimes predatory mites can benefit from the alternative prey side of things. I mean, you can see that with Baker plants where non-pest other mites can provide alternative prey for them. Yeah. And basically, but having some microclimates that still allow them to have some sort of microclimate that works well for them in terms of not too exposed can be beneficial.
Okay. Any inset on plants that provide overwintering habitat for parasitoid wasps?
I think that gets at something about if you're focusing on a particular predator or beneficial species, is like what is their life cycle? What is their overwintering, stage? And so it's going to be different for all of them. Some of them will overwinter inside, as in, a minute larvae inside of an insect and then come out in the spring. Some overwinter as adults, hiding in like shelter and needing to find a shelter. So it kind of depends, but having that what they need. So if it's something that overwinters within a plant, like so that just a reminder for the parasitoid life cycle is kind of like the Alien movie where it lays an egg inside the host and then it grows inside and bursts out as an adult. The larvae grows inside the host. And so if that's where it's overwintering, you need to make sure that that alternate food source is on the landscape for it to be there over the winter. If it overwinters an adult, then maybe you need shelter or something so it doesn't freeze out too much or whatever. But it kind of depends on the specifics for the animal.
And then Ian, there's a question about any way to attract whirligig mites.
I don't know. Yeah.
And then a bunch
Sorry.
of comments about pollen is eaten by predatory mites and it's good. And yeah. Great. Okay. If there's any other questions, put them in the chat. Otherwise, we can probably wrap up here. I wanted to just thank Ian and Michael for sharing all of this great information. Thanks to everyone for attending. We'd love your feedback. And if you need those CE credits, we need your license numbers. And the DPR credit requires you take a quick 10 question quiz. There are additional resources that are on the website that have been recommended, including a Xerces Society publication on habitat planning for beneficial insects. And we'd love to see you at our next webinar on the 28th.